In the heart of a busy city called Oak Ridge, there lived a woman who had become a beacon of hope for many. She wasn't just any woman. She was Judge Evelyn Carter, one of the few black judges in the area and someone known far and wide for her fairness and courage. People respected her because she didn't play favorites. Whether you were rich or poor, young or old, she treated everyone with the same level of respect and expected honesty in return. Her courtroom wasn't like other courtrooms where people whispered nervously or felt intimidated. Instead, it was a place where truth mattered more than power. Lawyers admired her sharp mind, defendants found solace in her calm demeanor, and even witnesses felt heard when they spoke under her watchful eye. But not everyone appreciated her way of doing things. Some people thought she challenged the system too much, especially those who liked bending rules to suit their needs. One such person was an officer named Dennis Grayson. He'd been on the police force for over 20 years and carried himself with a swagger that made him seem untouchable. To some, he was a hero, a tough guy keeping the streets safe. But to others, particularly minorities, he was something else entirely: arrogant, prejudiced, and dangerous. Over the years, several complaints had surfaced about his behavior, but nothing ever stuck. The system seemed to protect him every time. Grayson believed deeply in what he called law and order, though his interpretation often leaned more toward bullying than justice. He thought showing weakness meant losing control, so he never backed down from anyone or anything. This mindset worked well for him until the day his life collided with Judge Carter's in ways neither of them could have predicted. It all started during a routine hearing. Officer Grayson had been called to testify about an arrest gone wrong. The details weren't clear at first glance, but there were inconsistencies in his report that needed explaining. When Judge Carter began questioning him, the tension between them was palpable. You could almost feel it crackling in the air like static electricity before a storm. At first, Grayson tried to brush off her questions. He gave vague answers and avoided specifics, hoping she'd let it slide. But Judge Carter wasn't having any of it. She pressed harder, demanding clarity. That's when his tone shifted. At first, it was subtle, a slight edge creeping into his voice. Then came the condescending remarks, thinly veiled insults designed to undermine her authority without crossing any obvious lines. "Ma'am," he said, leaning forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as if sizing her up. "You wouldn't understand how things work out there." His words dripped with arrogance, implying that someone like her, a black woman sitting behind the bench, couldn't possibly grasp the realities of policing. The gallery fell silent. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see how Judge Carter would respond. Would she call him out, ignore him, or maybe find a way to diffuse the situation? What no one expected was the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. Years of dealing with men like Grayson, the ones who doubted her abilities simply because of her skin color, had taught her patience. But patience has its limits. Judge Carter paused for a moment, letting his comment hang in the air. Then, with a steady voice that commanded attention, she replied, "Officer, your job is to uphold the law, not decide who does or doesn't understand it. Now answer the question." Her response left Grayson visibly irritated. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face reddening. It was clear he wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he considered inferior. As the hearing continued, the friction between them grew thicker, setting the stage for something explosive. What happened next would shock everyone in that courtroom and spark a chain of events that nobody could have anticipated. But for now, the tension hung heavy like the calm before a storm. Little did they know this encounter was about to become unforgettable. The courtroom buzzed with an uneasy energy as Judge Carter continued her line of questioning. Officer Grayson, now visibly frustrated, shifted in his seat. His face was flushed, and his jaw clenched tightly, like he was holding back words that were desperate to escape. The tension between them had become a living thing, filling the room and making everyone uncomfortable. Lawyers scribbled notes nervously, witnesses fidgeted in their seats, and even the court stenographer seemed to type slower, as if trying not to draw attention to herself. Judge Carter's voice remained steady, but there was a sharpness to it now, a clear signal that she wasn't going to let this slide. She asked him again about the discrepancies in his report, pressing for details that would either confirm or refute his version of events. But instead of answering, Grayson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the witness stand. His tone turned icy, almost mocking. "You know what, Your Honor?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe if you spent less time behind this bench and more time out there," he gestured vaguely toward the door, "you'd understand why we do things the way we do." The room fell silent. Even the faint hum of the air conditioner seemed to pause. Everyone knew the subtext of his words. "You don't belong here. You're just a woman, a black woman at that." It wasn't the first time someone had tried to undermine her authority, but it was rare for anyone to be so brazen about it in open court. Judge Carter didn't flinch. She sat up straighter, her expression unreadable, like a storm cloud gathering before the rain. Her fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the bench, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but those who knew her well recognized it as a sign of simmering anger. Still, she kept her composure, responding calmly but firmly. "Officer, your personal opinions are irrelevant here. What matters is whether your actions align with the law. Now, answer the question." For a moment, it seemed like Grayson might actually comply. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. But instead of answering, he did something unexpected. He laughed, a short, bitter bark of laughter that echoed through the silent courtroom. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Then louder, he added, "I'm done with this nonsense." Before anyone could react, he stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair in the process. The sound of wood scraping against the floor jolted everyone into alertness. Security guards exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene. The gallery murmured anxiously, some people leaning forward to get a better view, while others recoiled instinctively. Grayson took a step toward the railing separating the witness stand from the judge's bench. For a split second, it looked like he might simply walk out of the courtroom, but then something snapped inside him. Maybe it was frustration. Maybe it was years of unchecked arrogance finally boiling over. Whatever it was, it drove him to make a decision that shocked everyone present, including himself. With a sudden burst of rage, he lunged across the railing, swinging his arm wildly. Before anyone could stop him, his fist connected with Judge Carter's face. The impact was loud enough to echo through the room, followed immediately by gasps of disbelief. People jumped to their feet, shouting and pointing. Some screamed, while others froze in place, unable to process what they'd just seen. For a few seconds, time seemed to stand still. Judge Carter staggered back slightly, her hand flying to her cheek where Grayson's punch had landed. Her glasses hung crookedly. On her face, one lens cracked from the force of the blow. But despite the shock and the pain, it was clear she wasn't about to stay down. Her eyes blazed with fury, and though her breathing was ragged, she didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, she straightened up and swung back, landing a punch of her own squarely on Grayson's jaw. The crack of knuckles meeting bone reverberated through the room, leaving no doubt that this was real, not some staged drama. Grayson stumbled backward, clutching his face in disbelief. "What the hell?" he shouted, his voice cracking with shock and outrage. His expression was a mix of confusion and humiliation, like he couldn't believe what had just happened. No one else could either. The entire courtroom erupted into chaos, with people yelling, scrambling for cover, or pulling out their phones to record the scene. Security officers rushed in from all sides, grabbing Grayson and dragging him away before he could retaliate further. Judge Carter, meanwhile, steadied herself against the bench, her chest rising and falling rapidly as adrenaline coursed through her veins. She adjusted her glasses, wincing slightly as the broken lens dug into her skin, but she didn't look away. Instead, she scanned the room, meeting the wide-eyed stares of those who had witnessed everything. When the initial commotion began to die down, she raised a hand, signaling for quiet. Slowly, the noise subsided, replaced by an eerie stillness. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, waiting to see what she would say next. "This behavior will not be tolerated," she declared, her voice firm despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "No one, not even those sworn to uphold the law, is above it. Today proves that." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For many in the courtroom, this wasn't just about a single incident. It was symbolic of larger issues plaguing the justice system. Here was a judge, a figure of authority, standing up not only for herself but also for countless others who had been silenced or dismissed because of their race, gender, or both. As security led Grayson out of the room, his protests fading into the distance, the weight of what had happened settled over everyone. This wasn't just a courtroom drama anymore. It was history unfolding right before their eyes, raw and unfiltered. And as Judge Carter took a deep breath and prepared to regain control of her courtroom, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom was still buzzing with shock and disbelief as Judge Carter stood there, her hand pressed lightly against her cheek where the punch had landed. Her glasses were slightly askew, one lens cracked, but she didn't seem to care about the damage to them or to herself. What mattered most in that moment was regaining control of the situation. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly as if trying to steady not just her own nerves but also the chaotic energy swirling around her. For a few seconds, no one moved. The security officers who had dragged Officer Grayson out were lingering, near the door, unsure if they should stay or leave. Lawyers whispered urgently among themselves, their faces pale with disbelief. Witnesses sat frozen in their seats, some covering their mouths in horror, others leaning forward with wide eyes, unable to look away. It felt like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Judge Carter finally broke the silence. "Court is adjourned," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor of emotion underneath. "We will reconvene after this matter has been addressed." With that, she turned and walked briskly toward her chambers, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The sound echoed through the stunned room, snapping people out of their daze. Slowly, the gallery began to empty as people filed out, murmuring amongst themselves about what they had just witnessed. Behind closed doors, Judge Carter leaned back against her desk, letting out a long sigh. Her heart was racing, and her hands shook slightly as she tried to process everything that had happened. She wasn't naive. She knew racism existed, especially within institutions like law enforcement. But experiencing it so blatantly in her own courtroom was something entirely different. It stung more than the physical blow itself. She glanced at her reflection in the small mirror hanging on the wall. Her cheek was already starting to bruise, a dark purple mark spreading across her skin. She touched it gently, wincing at the tenderness. For a moment she allowed herself to feel the anger, the frustration, the sheer exhaustion of constantly having to prove herself in spaces that weren't always welcoming. But then she straightened up, squaring her shoulders. Feeling sorry for herself wouldn't change anything. Action would. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, news of the incident spread faster than wildfire. Within minutes, reporters gathered at the steps, microphones in hand, eager to get statements from anyone willing to talk. Social media exploded with reactions. Videos recorded by courtroom attendees went viral almost instantly, showing the exact moment when Grayson lunged over the railing and threw the punch. Comments poured in from all sides, some supportive, others critical. But one thing was clear: this story had captured the nation's attention. Back inside, security personnel scrambled to file reports, while administrators debated how to handle the fallout. Word quickly reached higher-ups in the judicial system, prompting emergency meetings to discuss the implications of what had occurred. Was this an isolated incident, or did it point to deeper systemic issues? And perhaps most importantly, how should they respond? Officer Grayson, meanwhile, found himself locked in a holding cell, stewing in his own humiliation. He couldn't believe what had happened. In his mind, he'd been provoked, disrespected, and lashing out had seemed justified in the heat of the moment. But now, sitting alone in that cold, sterile room, reality began to sink in. This wasn't just a scuffle, it was assault. On a judge, in front of dozens of witnesses. His career, and possibly his freedom, was on the line. As the hours passed, Judge Carter emerged from her chambers, flanked by two trusted colleagues. One was a senior judge who had mentored her early in her career, and the other was a close friend who worked as a civil rights attorney. They walked her to her car, shielding her from the throng of reporters shouting questions. Cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every step she took. Despite the chaos, she kept her head high, refusing to show weakness. Once safely inside her vehicle, she exhaled deeply, resting her forehead against the steering wheel for a moment. "What a mess," she muttered under her breath. Her friends exchanged worried glances but said nothing. They knew better than to push her right now. Instead, they simply offered quiet support, knowing she needed time to process everything. That evening, Judge Carter returned home to find her phone flooded with messages. Friends, family members, former colleagues, all reaching out to check on her. Some praised her bravery, calling her actions inspiring. Others expressed concern, urging her to take care of herself amidst the storm. She appreciated their kindness, even though part of her wanted nothing more than to shut off her phone and retreat into solitude. But retreating wasn't an option. Not now. As much as she might have wanted to step back and let the world deal with the fallout, she knew she couldn't. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was bigger than her. The incident had shone a spotlight on issues that had long been swept under the rug: racial bias in policing, the abuse of power, and the challenges faced by minorities in positions of authority. People were watching, and they expected answers. Late that night, unable to sleep, Judge Carter sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. She pulled out a notebook and began jotting down thoughts, ideas for reforms, strategies for addressing systemic problems, ways to turn this painful experience into something meaningful. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be criticism, backlash, maybe even attempts to discredit her. But she also knew she couldn't stay silent. Too many people depended on her to speak up. As dawn broke, casting soft light through her windows, Judge Carter made a decision. She wouldn't let fear dictate her actions. Whatever came next, she would face it head on, with courage, determination, and unwavering resolve. Because in standing up for herself, she realized she was standing up for so many others too. By the next morning, the story had exploded far beyond the walls of the courthouse. News outlets across the country were running headlines about the incident, replaying shaky cell phone footage of the altercation in endless loops. Social media was ablaze with opinions, some praising Judge Carter for standing her ground, others criticizing her for responding physically. The debate raged on talk shows, podcasts, and comment sections, with everyone weighing in on what they thought should have happened. For Judge Carter, waking up to this whirlwind of attention was overwhelming. She hadn't asked for any of it. All she'd done was defend herself against an unprovoked attack in her own courtroom, a space meant to uphold justice and fairness. But now, her life felt like it was under a microscope. Every decision she'd ever made, every word she'd ever spoken, seemed open to scrutiny. It was exhausting, but she reminded herself why she'd become a judge in the first place: to fight for fairness, even when it wasn't easy. That same morning, Officer Grayson found himself facing a disciplinary hearing behind closed doors. His superiors weren't happy, not just because of the public embarrassment he'd caused, but also because his actions had exposed cracks in the system they'd long tried to ignore. For years, complaints about him had piled up, only to be brushed aside or buried. Now those grievances came flooding back into the spotlight. Former colleagues, community members, and even victims of his past misconduct began speaking out, sharing their stories with reporters and investigators. One woman recounted how he'd pulled her over for no reason other than the color of her skin, accusing her of driving a stolen car despite having all the proper documents. Another man described being roughed up during an arrest that turned out to be based on faulty information. These accounts painted a troubling picture of someone who believed he was untouchable and who had operated that way for far too long. The days passed, the pressure mounted on both sides. Judge Carter faced not only public opinion but also internal reviews within the judicial system. A panel of her peers convened to examine whether her response, throwing a punch in retaliation, had violated ethical codes governing judicial conduct. Some argued that judges were expected to rise above such behavior, no matter the provocation. Others pointed out that expecting someone to remain passive while being physically attacked was unrealistic, especially given the circumstances. During the review, Judge Carter listened quietly as lawyers debated her case. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't shy away from the truth. "I didn't plan to hit him," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "But I also didn't plan to sit there and let him assault me without defending myself. We talk a lot about justice in this profession, but we rarely address what happens when the system fails us personally. This wasn't just about me. It was about sending a message that no one is above accountability." Her words resonated deeply with many people, particularly women and minorities who had faced similar situations where power dynamics left them feeling powerless. Support poured in from unexpected places. Lawyers, activists, even retired judges who had faced discrimination themselves. They rallied around her, organizing petitions and public campaigns to show solidarity. Meanwhile, Officer Grayson's fate hung precariously in the balance. His disciplinary hearing revealed patterns of misconduct stretching back decades. Internal affairs investigators uncovered evidence of falsified reports, excessive use of force, and blatant disregard for protocol. Witnesses came forward, emboldened by the public outcry, to share their experiences. One particularly damning testimony came from a fellow officer who admitted to witnessing Grayson planting evidence during an arrest years ago. That admission alone was enough to seal his fate. In the end, the department had no choice but to act. Officer Grayson was fired from the force and charged with assault. The news sent shockwaves through the police community, with some officers expressing outrage at the decision, while others quietly acknowledged that it was long overdue. To the public, however, it felt like a rare victory, a moment when the system actually worked the way it was supposed to. But the fallout wasn't limited to Grayson. His dismissal sparked broader conversations about policing reform. Community leaders organized town halls to discuss systemic racism within law enforcement, drawing large crowds eager to push for change. Legislators introduced bills aimed at increasing transparency and accountability, including measures to create independent oversight boards for police departments. For the first time in years, it felt like progress might actually be possible. Back in her chambers, Judge Carter reflected on everything that had transpired. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth. While the immediate crisis had subsided, she understood that true change required sustained effort. People would forget about the incident eventually, moving on to the next big story. But the issues it highlighted, racism, abuse of power, and inequality, would persist unless addressed head-on. She decided to take action. Using her platform, she began advocating for reforms within the judicial system, pushing for better training, and support for judges from marginalized communities. She partnered with local organizations to host workshops and mentor young lawyers, encouraging them to pursue careers in law despite the challenges they might face. Her goal wasn't just to inspire others. It was to build a network of allies who could continue the work long after she was gone. Despite the chaos and scrutiny, Judge Carter refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, she channeled her energy into hope. She reminded herself daily that setbacks were part of the journey, but they didn't define the destination. Every challenge presented an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to make a difference. And so, as the weeks turned into months, the story of the courtroom brawl faded from the headlines. But its impact lingered, woven into the fabric of a city and a nation that had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths. For Judge Carter, it wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about proving that standing up for yourself wasn't just an act of defiance, it was an act of courage. And sometimes courage was the first step toward real change. The weeks following the courtroom incident were a whirlwind for Judge Carter. While the initial shock had begun to settle, the ripple effects of what happened continued to shape not just her life, but also the community around her. The disciplinary hearings for Officer Grayson wrapped up with a verdict that sent a clear message. No one was above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it. His firing and subsequent criminal charges became a watershed moment in Oak Ridge, sparking conversations about accountability that many had avoided for years. For Judge Carter, however, the fight wasn't over. Once the dust settled on Grayson's case, attention turned back to her. The panel reviewing her conduct as a judge reconvened multiple times, dissecting every detail of the altercation. Lawyers argued passionately on both sides, some defending her right to self-defense, others questioning whether her actions undermined the dignity of the judiciary. It was a tense process, filled with long days of testimony and deliberation. During one particularly heated session, an attorney representing the Judicial Review Board pressed her hard. "Your Honor," he said, leaning forward with a challenging tone, "isn't it true that judges are expected to remain impartial and composed at all times? Doesn't retaliating in kind blur the lines between justice and vengeance?" Judge Carter didn't flinch. She took a deep breath, letting his words hang in the air before responding. "I understand your point," she began, her voice steady, despite the weight of the moment. "But let me ask you something. When someone crosses the line, when they violate not just protocol but basic human decency, what is the appropriate response? Should I have sat there and allowed myself to be attacked without defending myself? Or should I stand firm and show that abuse of power will not be tolerated, regardless of who wields it?" Her response drew murmurs from the crowd gathered in the hearing room. Some nodded in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. What made her argument compelling wasn't just her logic, it was the raw emotion behind it. She spoke not just as a judge, but as a person who had faced discrimination and prejudice throughout her career. Her words resonated with anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority. As the review continued, more voices joined the conversation. Experts testified about the unique pressures faced by women and minorities in positions of power, particularly in systems historically dominated by white men. One psychologist explained how years of enduring microaggressions and outright hostility could lead to moments of heightened reaction, especially when pushed to the brink. Another legal scholar pointed out that expecting perfection under such circumstances was unrealistic and potentially harmful. Community members also weighed in, submitting letters and petitions in support of Judge Carter. Many shared personal stories of encountering similar situations, where standing up for themselves had been met with criticism rather than understanding. Their messages weren't just expressions of solidarity, they were reminders that this case represented something larger, a struggle for recognition and respect. Finally, after weeks of deliberation, the panel reached its decision. They acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the incident, noting that Judge Carter had acted in self-defense during an unprecedented situation. While they urged her to seek additional training in conflict resolution moving forward, they ultimately decided not to impose any formal sanctions. In their statement, they emphasized the importance of context, stating, "Justice must account for humanity." To ignore the circumstances surrounding this event would be to dismiss the realities faced by countless individuals striving for fairness in an imperfect system. The announcement brought a wave of relief and pride, not just for Judge Carter but for everyone who had supported her. For many, the outcome symbolized hope, proof that speaking out against injustice could lead to meaningful change. But Judge Carter knew better than to rest on her laurels. She recognized that the real work lay ahead. In the months that followed, she threw herself into advocacy efforts, determined to turn the spotlight on systemic issues within both policing and the judiciary. She partnered with grassroots organizations to host forums and workshops, bringing together community members, law enforcement officials, and policymakers to discuss ways to improve trust and transparency. These events weren't always easy. Tensions often ran high, but they were necessary steps toward bridging divides. One evening, during a packed town hall meeting, a young woman stood up to speak. Her hands trembled as she gripped the microphone, but her voice rang out strong. "I want to thank Judge Carter for showing us that we don't have to stay silent," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "Growing up, I always thought fighting back meant losing. But seeing her stand up for herself gave me courage. If she can do it in a courtroom, maybe I can do it in my own life." The room erupted in applause, and Judge Carter felt a lump rise in her throat. Moments like these reminded her why she kept pushing forward, even when it felt impossible. Change didn't happen overnight, but each small victory mattered. Each voice added to the chorus, demanding better. Meanwhile, Officer Grayson faded into obscurity, his name synonymous with disgrace. Without a badge or pension to fall back on, he struggled to find work, ostracized by former colleagues and shunned by the community. For some, his downfall served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that unchecked privilege and prejudice carried consequences. But for others, it was validation that holding powerful figures accountable was possible, even in a system rigged against fairness. As time passed, Judge Carter returned to her duties on the bench, carrying the lessons of the past year with her. She approached each case with renewed determination, knowing that her role extended beyond delivering verdicts. She was a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope for those navigating systems designed to marginalize them. And though the scars, both visible and invisible, remained, she wore them as badges of honor. For Oak Ridge, the courtroom brawl became more than just a story. It ignited movements, sparked reforms, and inspired ordinary people to demand extraordinary change. The battle wasn't over, but thanks to Judge Carter's courage, the foundation for a brighter future had been laid. And sometimes, that was enough. Months after the courtroom incident, life in Oak Ridge began to settle into a new rhythm. But it wasn't the same old rhythm. The events surrounding Judge Carter and Officer Grayson had left an indelible mark on the city, sparking conversations that refused to die down. People who had once turned a blind eye to issues of racism, abuse of power, and inequality were now actively engaging in discussions about how to create real change. For many, it felt like a turning point, a moment when complacency gave way to action. Judge Carter returned to her courtroom with a quiet strength that inspired everyone around her. She carried herself differently now, not because she was trying to prove anything, but because she no longer felt the need to shrink or soften her presence. Her decisions on the bench remained fair and thoughtful, but there was also a newfound boldness in how she addressed challenges. Whether it was calling out procedural misconduct or standing firm against intimidation tactics, she made it clear that justice wasn't negotiable. Her influence extended far beyond the courtroom walls. Community leaders, activists, and even some forward-thinking politicians began reaching out to collaborate on initiatives aimed at reforming both the judicial system and law enforcement practices. One of these efforts led to the creation of a citizen oversight board designed to hold police officers accountable for their actions. It wasn't perfect. There were disagreements and growing pains, but it represented progress, something tangible that people could rally behind. For Judge Carter, mentoring young lawyers became a priority. She often stayed late at the courthouse, meeting with interns and newly minted attorneys eager to learn from her experiences. Many of them came from backgrounds similar to hers, underrepresented communities where opportunities were scarce, and success often required overcoming obstacles most others couldn't imagine. She didn't just teach them about the law, she taught them about resilience, integrity, and the importance of staying true to themselves, even when the world pushed back. One evening, during one of these mentoring sessions, a young man hesitated before asking a question that had clearly been weighing on his mind. "Your Honor," he said, glancing down at his hands, "how do you keep going when so many people are against you? I mean, what happened in court? It must have been terrifying." "Judge," Carter smiled softly, leaning back in her chair as if choosing her words carefully. "It was terrifying," she admitted. "But here's the thing. Fear isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it reminds us what's at stake. What keeps me going is knowing that giving up won't solve anything. Every time I step into that courtroom, I think about all the people counting on me, not just today but tomorrow and the day after that. If I don't show up, who will?" Her answer seemed to resonate deeply with the young man, who nodded slowly, his expression softening. Moments like these reminded her why mentorship mattered. It wasn't just about teaching skills. It was about planting seeds of hope in the next generation. As for Officer Grayson, his story faded into obscurity, though not without consequence. Stripped of his badge and pension, he struggled to rebuild his life. Some might have seen this as poetic justice, but Judge Carter viewed it differently. To her, his downfall wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. It served as a reminder that unchecked power could destroy lives, including those who wielded it recklessly. Still, she hoped he would reflect on his actions and perhaps emerge with a better understanding of the harm he'd caused. The broader impact of the incident continued to unfold over time. Schools incorporated discussions about systemic racism and privilege into their curriculums, encouraging students to think critically about fairness and equality. Local businesses pledged to diversify their leadership teams, recognizing that representation mattered. Even within the police department, changes began to take shape, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Training programs focused more on de-escalation, techniques, and cultural sensitivity, while anonymous reporting systems allowed officers to flag misconduct without fear of retaliation. Of course, not everyone embraced these changes willingly. There were protests, heated debates, and moments when it seemed like progress might stall altogether. But Judge Carter never lost sight of the bigger picture. She knew that change was messy, uncomfortable, and often painful, yet she also believed it was worth fighting for. On a crisp autumn morning, nearly a year after the courtroom altercation, Judge Carter stood outside the courthouse, gazing up at its towering columns. Reporters still lingered occasionally, hoping for another headline-worthy soundbite, but she paid them little mind. Instead, her thoughts drifted to the journey she'd been on, the highs, the lows, and everything in between. As she prepared to enter the building, a familiar face approached her. It was the young woman who had spoken at the town hall months earlier, the one whose heartfelt words had brought tears to her eyes. Now the young woman wore a suit and carried a briefcase, her demeanor confident, yet humble. "Your Honor," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile, "I wanted to let you know, I passed the bar exam last week." Judge Carter's eyes lit up with pride. "Congratulations," she said, shaking the young woman's hand firmly. "You've earned every bit of this." "I couldn't have done it without your guidance," the young woman replied earnestly. "Seeing you stand up for yourself showed me that it's possible to fight for justice without losing yourself in the process. I hope I can make you proud." "You already have," Judge Carter said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "And remember, this is just the beginning. The work we do matters not just for ourselves but for everyone who comes after us." With that, they parted ways, each heading toward their respective responsibilities. But as Judge Cabin walked through the courthouse doors, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, the road ahead would still be challenging. Yes, there would be setbacks and moments of doubt. But she also knew that every small victory added up, creating ripples that could eventually turn into waves. Years later, when historians looked back on Oak Ridge during this period, they wouldn't just see a courtroom brawl, they'd see a catalyst for transformation. Judge Carter's courage had ignited a movement, inspiring countless individuals to demand better, to strive for fairness, and to believe in the possibility of change. And though she never sought recognition for her role, her legacy endured, not as a symbol of conflict, but as a testament to the enduring power of standing up for what's right.